Some stories begin with a gunshot. This one begins with a blanket. In a cruel Montana winter, Abigail Vance has almost nothing left. No husband, no mother, no warmth, and little hope. Yet when she sees a stranger freezing in the snow, she chooses his life over her own comfort. What she doesn't know is that this single act of compassion will lead her into a fight against greed, hidden debts, and a powerful man who believes money can buy the truth. Listen closely, because this is not only a Western tale, it is a story about the kind of heart that can change a whole town. If you found meaning in Abigail's journey, subscribe for more heartfelt tales from the Western frontier.
The air in Montana doesn't just get cold. It gets sharp. It turns into 1,000 tiny needles that find the gaps in your clothes and the cracks in your spirit. Abigail Vance stood outside the general store, her fingers white-knuckled around the edges of her mother's wool blanket. It was blue, the color of a summer sky she hadn't seen in months. It was the only thing she had left that smelled like home, back before the fever took her mother and the law took her husband. She needed flour. She needed salt. But mostly, she needed to believe that the world wasn't as hollow as her stomach felt. Then she saw him. He was slumped against the hitching post at the edge of town, half buried in a drift of gray slush. His coat was rags. His boots were split. He wasn't moving, save for a shallow, rattling hitch in his chest that sounded like gravel in a tin can. Abigail walked over. She looked at the man, then at her blanket. "You're dying, aren't you?" she asked softly. The man didn't answer. His eyes were closed, frosted shut by the rime of his own breath. Abigail felt the wind bite through her thin shawl. She knew the math. If she kept the blanket, she might stay warm enough to see Tuesday. If she sold it, she could buy him the medicine that might, just might, keep his heart beating another hour. She didn't hesitate. She walked into the pawn shop. The bell chimed. It sounded like a funeral knell. The man behind the counter, a fellow with a face like crumpled parchment, eyed the blue wool. $2, he grunted. "Not a penny more." "It's worth 10, Abigail said, her voice steady. "But I don't have time to haggle with a man who weighs silver against souls." She took the 2 coins. She bought the tincture and the broth. She went back to the man in the snow and wrapped the medicine in her prayer. As she lifted his head to press the cup to his lips, she looked right into his frozen face and spoke the truth out loud. "Listen to me," she said, her voice ringing in the quiet street. "I am doing this because a person's worth is not measured by the gold in their pocket, but by the dignity we afford them when they have nothing left. You are a human being. That is enough reason for me to be cold so that you might live." She poured the broth. She felt her own limbs begin to shake as the heat left her body. "Do you hear me?" she whispered. "Poverty is a circumstance, not a character flaw. I refuse to be a person who values my own comfort over the life of a fellow traveler. We have to be better than the dirt we walk on." The man's hand suddenly clamped around her wrist. It wasn't the grip of a dying man. It was strong. It was calloused. It was the grip of a man who owned the very ground they were sitting on. His eyes opened. They weren't clouded with death. They were gray and sharp, like flint hitting steel. "You sold your only protection for a stranger," he said. His voice was deep, a low rumble that came from somewhere powerful. "I sold a thing to save a life," Abigail snapped, trying to pull away. "There is no profit in a warm blanket if it covers a heart that has turned to stone." The man stood up. He didn't wobble. He shed the snow from his rags like a king shedding a cloak. Across the street, the pawnshop door opened, and a man in a fine suit stepped out, nodding to the drifter. Abigail stepped back, the cold finally hitting her marrow. "Who are you?" "My name is Wyatt Coldwell," the man said. He looked at her with a mix of shame and something that looked like awe. And I was looking for one honest soul in a town full of shadows. I found you, Abigail Vance. But I think I've put a price on your kindness that I'm not sure I can pay. Abigail didn't thank him. She didn't faint. She just stood there in the wind, shivering, her blue blanket gone, and her eyes fixed on the man who had turned her sacrifice into a game. You tested me, she said, the realization bitter as gall. You used your wealth to play God with my last shred of hope. That is a hollow victory, Wyatt. Mercy shouldn't be a staged performance for your curiosity. Every life has value, regardless of whether a rich man is watching or not. The snow began to fall again, harder this time, and for the first time in 4 years, Wyatt Coldwell had nothing to say. The sheriff's office smelled of stale coffee and old sins. It was a small room. The walls were thick timber, notched and scarred, holding back the Montana wind that rattled the window panes like a debt collector. Abigail stood in the center of the room. She was still shivering. The heat of the iron stove in the corner felt like a slap against her frozen skin. Wyatt Coldwell sat behind a desk made of solid oak. He didn't look like a dying man anymore. He looked like a man who owned the horizon. His badge was pinned to a vest of fine leather. It caught the light and threw it back, cold and silver. Sit down, Abigail, Wyatt said. He didn't order it, he offered it. But the air between them was heavy with the lie he had lived on the sidewalk. Abigail didn't sit. She stood straight. Her spine was the only thing she had left that wasn't broken. I didn't come here for a chair, she said. Her voice was thin but sharp. I came for the land. My husband, Silas Vance, bought a parcel on the North Creek. I have the papers. I have the right. Wyatt looked at a stack of ledgers on his desk. He didn't touch them. He just looked. Silas Vance is dead, Abigail. He died in the dark 4 years back. The land doesn't care about names once the blood has dried into the dirt. The land might not care, but the law should, Abigail replied. She stepped closer to the desk. I walked 20 miles to get to this town. I sold my mother's blanket to save a man I thought was breathing his last. I did that because I believe that every human being deserves a chance to survive, regardless of their station. I didn't do it so a rich man could play act at misery. Wyatt flinched. It was a small movement, just a flicker in his gray eyes. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the town he protected and the ranch he owned. I wasn't play acting at misery, Abigail, he said, his back to her. I was looking for something else. This town is full of people who would step over a corpse to find a nickel. I needed to know if there was one person left who saw a man's life as more valuable than their own comfort. I found you, but I didn't expect you to be his widow. He turned around. His face was a mask of controlled pain. Listen to me, Wyatt said. He pointed a finger at the floor. There is a lesson here that most people in this territory forget until it is too late. Power and wealth are just tools. They don't make a man better. They just make him louder. I used my power to test you, and in doing so, I failed the very standard of dignity I was looking for. I treated you like an object in an experiment. That was wrong. Real respect means treating every person as an end in themselves, never as a means to an end. Abigail watched him. She wanted to hate him. It would have been easier. But she saw the ghost in his eyes. It was the same ghost she saw in the mirror every morning. You speak well for a man who lies in the snow for fun, she said. It wasn't for fun, Wyatt whispered. It was for penance. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a heavy key. He laid it on the desk. That's the key to the old schoolhouse on the creek. Your husband was building it. It's on the land you claim. But Silas Sterling, the man who runs the cattle syndicate, says the debt on that land is higher than the grass in June, he says. Your husband borrowed money he couldn't pay back. He says the land belongs to the syndicate now. Abigail felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. My husband didn't borrow a dime. He hated debt. He used to say that debt is just a different kind of cage, and a man who owes another man his livelihood isn't truly free. I believe you, Wyatt said, but Sterling has the papers, or he says he does. In this territory, a piece of paper with a signature carries more weight than a woman's word. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. He walked around the desk. He stood too close. He smelled like cedar and expensive tobacco. I am going to tell you something you need to hear, Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic thrum. The world is divided into people who use the law to help and people who use the law to hunt. Silas Sterling is a hunter. He believes that because he has the most gold, he has the most right to decide who lives and who starves. But that is a lie. True equality means that the law must protect the person with nothing, just as fiercely as it protects the person with everything. If it doesn't, it isn't law. It's just a weapon for the bully. Abigail took the key. It was cold and heavy in her palm. Then help me, she said. Don't give me charity. Don't buy me a new blanket. Help me find the truth. You owe me that much for the lie you told in the slush. Wyatt nodded once. I owe you more than that, Abigail. I owe you a debt that can't be paid in coin. He walked her to the door. As she stepped out into the biting wind, he spoke one last time. Go to the schoolhouse. Stay inside. Keep the stove hot. I'll be out there by sundown. And Abigail, take this. He handed her a heavy coat. It was lined with sheepskin. It was warm. It was expensive. I'm not taking your charity, she said. It isn't charity, Wyatt said. It's a down payment on the truth. And remember this, justice isn't something that just happens. It's something you have to build, stone by stone, even when your hands are bleeding. Abigail took the coat. She wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't thank him. She just turned and walked toward the creek, her boots crunching on the frozen earth, a widow with a key and a heart that was starting to burn. The schoolhouse sat on a rise overlooking the water. It was a skeleton of a building. Silas had raised the frame and finished the walls, but the roof was only half shingled. It looked like a rib cage picked clean by the winter. Abigail spent the afternoon hauling wood. Her muscles screamed. Her breath came in white plumes. But she didn't stop. She worked because work was a prayer. She worked because if she stopped, the silence of the Montana plains would swallow her whole. She got a fire going in the small potbelly stove Silas had hauled all the way from St. Louis. The iron began to glow a dull, comforting red. She sat on a crate and watched the flames. The sun was dropping behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range when she heard the horses. 2 of them, walking slow. She stood up and moved to the window. She saw Wyatt Coldwell. He was riding a massive black stallion that looked like it was made of midnight. Beside him was a man she didn't know. He was tall, with skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that saw everything. He wore a badge, too. Abigail opened the door. The cold rushed in uninvited. This is Deputy Elias Reed, Wyatt said as he dismounted. He's the only man in this county who doesn't take his orders from a checkbook. Elias Reed tipped his hat. Ma'am, I heard you're the lady who sold her warmth for a sheriff who didn't need it. That's a rare kind of heart. It was a foolish kind of heart, Abigail said. Step inside. The fire is small, but it's honest. The men entered. The room felt crowded with their presence. Wyatt looked around at the unfinished rafters. He looked at the stacks of lumber Silas had cured with such care. Sterling's men were here an hour ago, Abigail said. They didn't see me. I was in the brush. They were looking for something. Wyatt frowned. What were they looking for? I don't know. But they were angry. One of them said that if they didn't find the ledger, Sterling would have their hides. Elias Reed looked at Wyatt. A silent conversation passed between them. It was the look of men who had seen the ugly side of the frontier too many times. Abigail, Wyatt said, stepping toward the fire. We need to talk about the gamble we are taking. Silas Sterling isn't just a rancher. He's a man who thinks he bought the future of this territory. He's been forcing smallholders off their land for years. He uses debt like a noose. He lends money at interest rates that no man can pay, and then he waits for the first bad winter to pull the cord. He paused, looking into the flames. There is a fundamental truth you need to understand about power, Wyatt continued. When one man controls another man's ability to eat, there is no such thing as a fair contract. It is an act of coercion, not a business deal. We live in a society that claims to value freedom, but there is no freedom where there is no economic independence. If you are beholden to a tyrant for your next meal, you aren't a citizen. You're a servant. Abigail nodded. My husband knew that. That's why he was building this school. He wanted the children of the settlers to learn how to read the contracts for themselves. He wanted them to have the tools to defend their own rights. That's exactly why he's dead, Elias Reed said quietly. Knowledge is a threat to men like Sterling. A man who can read a ledger can't be cheated. A man who understands his own value can't be bought. Wyatt reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. I found this in the pawn shop today. The owner tried to hide it. It belonged to your husband. Abigail took the book. Her fingers trembled. It was Silas's diary, but as she flipped through the pages, she saw rows of figures, names, dates, amounts of money. It's a record, she whispered. Silas was keeping track of every family Sterling cheated. He was building a case for the territorial court. That is the gamble, Wyatt said. That ledger is the only thing that can break Sterling's hold on this valley. But it's also a death warrant for anyone holding it. Sterling knows it exists. He's been looking for it since the night your husband died. He looked her straight in the eye. I need to tell you something plain, Wyatt said. I am a rich man. I have thousands of cattle and more land than I can ride across in a day. People think that makes me powerful, but I'm going to tell you the real truth. My wealth only matters if I use it to level the playing field for people like you. If I use it to hide behind or to buy my way out of trouble, I am no better than Silas Sterling. True leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about being responsible for the safety and the dignity of everyone under your shadow. He took a step closer. I failed that responsibility 4 years ago. I let Sterling convince me that your husband was a thief. I didn't look deep enough. I let my own status blind me to the truth of a better man. I am through being blind, Abigail. Suddenly, the sound of a rifle shot shattered the quiet. A bullet tore through the wooden door, sending a spray of splinters into the room. Wyatt reacted instantly. He tackled Abigail to the floor, shielding her with his body. Elias Reed was already at the window, his Winchester cocked and ready. They're here, Elias said. Sterling's men, at least 6 of them. Wyatt looked down at Abigail. He was heavy. He was solid. He was the man who had lied in the snow, and he was the man who was currently risking his life to keep her from being shot. Listen to me, Wyatt said, his voice calm even as the lead whistled overhead. We are in a fight now, not just for this schoolhouse, but for the principle of the thing. They think they can kill the truth by killing us, but they're wrong. The truth doesn't die just because the person speaking it does. But it's a lot easier to spread the truth if we stay alive. He pulled his Colt 45 from his holster. The click of the hammer was the loudest sound in the world. Abigail, get behind the stove. Stay low. Do not come out until I tell you. I'm not a child, Wyatt, she said, her adrenaline surging. I know you aren't, he replied. But I've already cost this world one, Vance. I'm not losing another because I was too proud to protect you. He crawled toward the other window. Elias, watch the flank. They want that ledger, but they're going to have to pay for it in blood. Abigail huddled behind the iron stove. The heat was still there, but the world had turned cold again. She held Silas's ledger to her chest. She realized then that the dying man she had saved in Chapter 1 had been tested. But this was the real exam. This was where the cost of integrity was measured in lead and fire. And as the darkness of the Montana night was lit by the muzzle flashes of the hunters outside, Abigail Vance realized that she was no longer just a widow. She was a witness, and she wasn't going to let the fire go out. The gunshots stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy. It was thick with the smell of burnt sulfur and the ringing in my ears. Outside, the Montana moon was a cold, white eye, looking down at the mess men make of the world. Wyatt didn't move for a long time. He stayed low, his body a shield between me and the window. He was breathing hard. I could feel the heat radiating off him. He wasn't just a sheriff anymore. He was a man who had realized that his gold couldn't buy off the darkness he'd let into the valley. They're circling, Elias whispered from the far corner. He didn't sound scared. He sounded like a man counting groceries. They know we're pinned. They're waiting for the fire in the stove to die down so they can use the dark. Wyatt stood up slow. He offered me a hand. His palm was rough. It was the hand of a man who had worked his way up before he started looking down. Abigail, he said. His voice was steady now. I need you to listen to what I'm about to say. It's the most important thing you'll hear tonight. I looked at him. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. In this territory, Wyatt began. People think that because Silas Sterling has 10,000 head of cattle and 1,000 acres of grass, he is a bigger man than the settler with 1 cow and a garden patch. They think his life is worth more. They think his word carries more weight in a court of law. But that is a grand, ugly lie. He looked toward the shattered door. The true measure of a civilization, Wyatt said, is the principle of radical equality. It means that the dignity of a human being is inherent. It doesn't come from a bank account. It doesn't come from a badge. It's born into you. When we allow a rich man to bully a poor woman just because he has the power to do it, we aren't just breaking a law. We are denying the very thing that makes us human. We are saying that some people are extra and some are less. And as long as we believe that, none of us are truly free. I gripped Silas's ledger. Is that why you're standing here? Because of a principle? Wyatt looked at me. Really looked at me. I'm standing here because I spent 4 years forgetting that principle. I let my own success make me think I was a better judge of character than the man who was actually doing the work. I looked at your husband and saw a troublemaker instead of a man seeking justice. I failed to see him as my equal, and that failure is what cost him his life. Elias Reed shifted his weight. Sheriff, they're moving in from the creek side. We don't have time for a sermon. It's not a sermon, Elias, Wyatt snapped. It's the reason we're going to win. They're fighting for a paycheck. We're fighting for the truth that every man and woman in this valley is a peer. A man fighting for his pocketbook will run when the lead gets too hot. A man fighting for his dignity will stand until the sun goes down. Wyatt turned back to the window. He checked his sidearm. The rhythm of his movements was calm. It was the rhythm of a man who had finally found his feet on solid ground. "Abigail," Wyatt said, "I want you to take Elias's horse. It's tethered in the draw behind the schoolhouse. Take the ledger. Ride toward the town. Don't go to the office. Go to the church. The bell ringer there is an old man named Miller. He's seen what Sterling does. He'll hide you. I'm not leaving you here to die for a mistake you made 4 years ago," I said. My voice was firmer than I expected. Wyatt paused. He looked at the floor. "It wouldn't be dying for a mistake. It would be living for a truth. But you have to go. Because if that ledger burns, Sterling wins. He'll continue to treat people like cattle. He'll keep erasing the rights of the smallholders because he thinks he owns the law. You are the only person who can prove that the law belongs to everyone." He stepped closer to me. The smell of cedar and gun smoke was all around us. "There is a lesson here about the nature of power," Wyatt said, speaking softly now. "Power is like fire. Used correctly, it keeps the house warm and the family fed. Used selfishly, it burns the whole town down. Silas Sterling thinks power is a prize to be hoarded. He doesn't understand that power is actually a trust. It's something given to you by your neighbors so you can protect them, not so you can devour them. When a man uses his power to steal from the people he's supposed to serve, he isn't a leader anymore. He's just a thief in a fine coat." He handed me a small lantern. It wasn't lit. "Keep this under your shawl," he said. "If you get lost, don't light it. Use the stars. Follow the North Star. It doesn't move. It doesn't lie. It's the only thing in this world that stays where it's supposed to be." I looked at the ledger. It was heavy. It felt like the weight of every family in the valley was trapped between those leather covers. "Wyatt," I said, "why did you really lie in the snow that first day? You said it was a test. But why test me?" Wyatt smiled. It was a sad, tired smile. "Because I wanted to see if I was wrong about humanity. I wanted to see if someone would still see the dying man instead of the worthless drifter. You saw the man. You saw the inherent value in a life that looked like it had no value left. You treated me with the respect that every human being deserves by right of birth. You taught me more in 10 minutes of kindness than I've learned in 10 years of being a sheriff." He pushed me toward the back door. "Go now," he whispered. "Elias and I will hold the front. We'll make enough noise that they won't look for a rider in the draw." I felt the cold Montana air hit my face as I stepped out into the night. It was sharp. It was honest. "Abigail," Wyatt called out one last time. I stopped. "Don't ever let them make you feel small," he said. "Not the rich ranchers, not the banks, not the men with the guns. You are a person of worth. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. And don't you ever apologize for claiming the space you were born to occupy." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just tucked the ledger under my sheepskin coat and ran for the draw. Behind me, the schoolhouse exploded in a fresh roar of gunfire. I heard Wyatt's voice shouting orders. I heard Elias's steady rifle fire. They were making a stand for a woman they barely knew and a man they'd already lost. As I found the horse and swung into the saddle, I realized that Wyatt Coldwell was right. The struggle in this valley wasn't about cattle or grass. It was about whether we were going to live in a world of masters and servants or a world of neighbors. I kicked the horse into a gallop. The wind bit at my cheeks. I looked up at the North Star. It was there. It was steady. It was waiting for the rest of us to catch up to its honesty. I wasn't just a widow running through the night. I was a messenger. And I had a story to tell about a man who had sold his pride to buy back his soul, and a woman who had sold her blanket to find her voice. The road to town was long. The shadows were deep. But for the first time in 4 years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I knew what I was carrying. I was carrying the light of the truth, and I knew that even the smallest light is enough to make a tyrant tremble. The horse beneath me was a ghost in the moonlight. I could feel his heart hammering through the leather of the saddle. It was a rhythmic, heavy beat. Thump, 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 thump. It matched the pulse in my own throat. I didn't look back. Wyatt had told me not to. He had stayed behind in that half-finished schoolhouse to hold a line that most men would have abandoned long ago. He was a rich man standing in the dirt for a poor woman's truth. It didn't make sense. And yet, it was the only thing that had made sense in a long time. Silver Creek looked different at 3 in the morning. It wasn't a town. It was a collection of shadows waiting for the sun to tell them who they were. The boardwalks were empty. The saloons were quiet, but I could feel eyes behind the curtains. A town like this never really sleeps. It just holds its breath. I steered the horse toward the church. It sat at the end of the main street, its steeple pointing like a warning finger at the stars. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the side, where the light of a single candle flickered in a small window. I knocked 3 times, short and sharp. The door creaked open. Old Miller stood there. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a piece of hickory, hard, wrinkled, and stubborn. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask why I was lathered in sweat and shaking from the cold. He just stepped aside and let me in. "The sheriff said you'd come," Miller said. His voice was like grinding stones. "He said you'd be carrying the weight of the world in your coat." I pulled Silas's ledger out. I laid it on the heavy wooden table in his kitchen. The candle hissed. "It's not the world," I said. "It's just the truth. But in this valley, I think they weigh about the same." Miller pulled a pair of spectacles from his pocket. He began to turn the pages. I watched his face. I saw his eyes widen. I saw his jaw set. He looked at the names. He looked at the interest rates. He looked at the dates of the foreclosures. "Abigail," Miller said, looking up. He took his spectacles off and leaned in close. He wanted me to hear him, truly hear him. "We have to speak about what is written here," he said, his voice slow and rhythmic. "This isn't just a list of debts. It is a record of a systemic betrayal. Listen to me closely. Every human being has a fundamental right to transparency. When a man in power hides the truth of a contract or obscures the reality of a debt to trap another person, he is committing a crime against human dignity. He is taking away their right to self-determination." He tapped the ledger with a gnarled finger. "A secret debt is a form of slavery," Miller continued. "When the rules of the game are hidden from the players, there is no fair play. There is only a predator and his prey. We must value the right to information. Without it, equality is just a word we use to feel better about ourselves while we watch our neighbors drown." Silas Sterling didn't just steal land. He stole the transparency that a free society requires to survive. I felt the truth of his words settle in my bones. It was what Silas had tried to tell me. It was why he had been building that school. "Wyatt is still out there," I whispered. "He's fighting them, Silas Sterling's men." "Wyatt Coldwell is a complicated man," Miller said. He walked to the stove and poured a cup of black coffee. He pushed it toward me. He spent a lot of years thinking his wealth made him a judge. But tonight, he's learning that his true wealth is his willingness to be an ally. He's realizing that his power is only justified when it's used to protect the transparency he once ignored. We sat in silence for a long time. The coffee was bitter. The room was cold. But the ledger felt like a hot coal on the table. Then I heard it, a horse, galloping hard. I stood up, my hand going to the small pistol in my pocket. Miller didn't move. He just watched the door. The door burst open. Wyatt stumbled in. He was leaning heavily on his left side. His coat was torn. There was blood on his sleeve, dark and wet in the candlelight. But his eyes were clear. He looked at me, and for a second the sheriff disappeared. He was just a man who was glad to see I was still breathing. "Elias?" I asked. "He's fine," Wyatt wheezed, dropping into a chair. "He's leading the rest of them on a chase toward the high ridge. They think we're both headed for the border." Miller stood up and began to cut away Wyatt's sleeve. "You're a fool, Wyatt. But you're a different kind of fool than you were yesterday." Wyatt winced as Miller cleaned the wound. It was a graze, deep but not fatal. Wyatt looked at me, then at the ledger. "Did you read it?" Wyatt asked. "Miller did," I said. "He told me what it means, about the hidden debts, about the transparency." Wyatt nodded. He looked at Miller. "I've been a blind man, Miller. I thought that as long as I followed the law as it was written, I was doing my job. I didn't realize that the law can be a mask for the most terrible kinds of theft if you don't look at who's holding the pen." Wyatt turned to me. He reached out and touched the edge of the ledger. "Abigail?" he said. He sounded like he was trying to work out a difficult problem in his head. "I want to say this clearly. We often talk about the right to life and liberty, but we rarely talk about the right to the truth in our dealings with one another. Honesty isn't just a personal virtue. It is a human right. When a man uses his superior position to deceive another person about the terms of their own life, he is violating their very soul. I allowed that to happen in my town. I am the sheriff, and I didn't demand the transparency that would have saved your husband." He paused, his breath hitching. "No person is better than another because they understand the law or have the money to hire those who do," Wyatt said, his voice finding a new rhythm. "The truth belongs to the man in the dirt just as much as it belongs to the man in the mansion. If we don't fight for that, then every badge in this territory is just a piece of tin. I owe this town more than just order. I owe them the truth, and I owe you my life for showing me where I dropped it." I looked at Wyatt. He was a rich man. He was a powerful man. But in that moment, he was just a neighbor. "What do we do now?" I asked. Wyatt stood up. He was pale, but he was steady. "Now we stop running. We take this ledger to the circuit judge. He arrives in the morning. We don't ask for a favor. We demand the law. We show him the hidden debts. We show him the rot." He looked at the window. The sky was turning a bruised purple. The dawn was coming. "Silas Sterling thinks he can buy the sun," Wyatt said. "But the sun doesn't take bribes. It just shines. And when it comes up today, it's going to shine on every name in that book." Miller handed Wyatt a fresh shirt. "You're going to need to be ready, Wyatt. Sterling won't go quiet. A man who has built his life on a lie will burn the whole world down before he admits the truth." "Let him try," Wyatt said. He looked at me. "I've already lost my pride. I've already lost my comfort. I don't have anything left to lose but my soul, and I'm not selling that for any price Sterling can offer." We stepped out of the church as the first sliver of gold hit the peaks of the mountains. The air was crisp. It felt like a new world. Wyatt helped me onto my horse. He didn't treat me like a lady. He treated me like a partner. Abigail, he said, holding the bridle for a second. Thank you. For the blanket. For the medicine. But mostly for the lesson. I learned that you can't test a heart until you're willing to show your own. I'm done testing people. I'm just going to start trusting them. I looked down at him. Trust is a gamble, Wyatt. It is, he said, a ghost of a smile appearing. But it's the only gamble that ever pays out anything worth keeping. We rode down the main street of Silver Creek as the town began to wake up. People stepped onto their porches. They watched the sheriff and the widow ride side by side toward the courthouse. They saw the ledger in my hand. They saw the blood on Wyatt's sleeve. The shadows were retreating. The light was taking over. And for the first time in 4 long years, the debt that had been crushing me didn't feel so heavy. I knew that the truth was finally coming due, and I knew that I wasn't the only one who was ready to pay. As we reached the courthouse steps, Wyatt dismounted and looked up at the building. It was a place of law. But today, we were going to make it a place of justice. Remember what I told you, Wyatt whispered. Dignity is born in you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I stepped off my horse and followed him up the steps. The sun was fully up now. It was bright. It was honest. It was exactly what we needed. I opened the ledger. I turned to the first page, and I waited for the world to start being right. The courthouse was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. The morning light was thin. It filtered through the dust motes in the hallway, painting long, pale stripes across the floorboards. Wyatt's on a heavy wooden bench. He looked smaller than he had in the schoolhouse. Maybe it was the blood on his sleeve. Or maybe it was just the weight of the day catching up to him. He was a man with 1,000 head of cattle and a town under his thumb. But right then, he looked like he was just trying to remember how to breathe. He reached into his saddlebag. He didn't look at me, he pulled out a bundle. It was blue, the color of a summer sky. My breath hitched. It was my blanket, the one I'd sold to the pawn shop for $2 and a cup of medicine. I went back for it, Wyatt said. His voice was low, rhythmic, like a slow-moving river. Miller told me where you'd been. I didn't want it, sitting in a cage behind a glass window. It didn't belong there. He handed it to me. The wool was soft. It still smelled like home. But it was different now. It had been through the dirt. It had been through a stranger's hands. Why? I asked. I held it to my chest. Wyatt looked at his hands. They were scarred. They were the hands of a man who had built a kingdom, but forgotten to build a life. Because we have to talk about what it means to heal, Abigail, he said. He looked at me then. His eyes were steady. Listen to me. There is a deep human truth we often miss when we are in pain. We think that healing is something that just happens to us over time. We think if we wait long enough, the hurt will go away. But that's a lie. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Healing is a conscious act of restoration, Wyatt said. It is the choice to stitch back together the parts of the world we've allowed to break. I spent 4 years self-punishing. I thought that if I lived in a cold office and worked until I bled, I was doing penance for your husband's death. But self-punishment isn't penance. It's just another form of pride. True penance is empathy. It is the act of stepping into another person's shoes and feeling the weight they carry. He gestured toward the blanket. Buying that back wasn't a gift, he said. It was a recognition. It was me saying that your sacrifice was seen. It was me admitting that my test was a violation of your dignity. We can't fix the past, Abigail, but we can decide that the future will be built on respect instead of tests. I felt the knots in my stomach start to loosen. It wasn't just the blanket. It was the words. "I spent a long time hating you, Wyatt," I said, "even before I knew it was you who pulled the trigger. I hated the idea of you, the rich man, the man who didn't have to worry about where his next meal was coming from." "I know," Wyatt said, "and you had every right. But here's the thing about hate. It's a closed door. It keeps you safe, but it also keeps you in the dark. We have a right to be angry. We have a right to seek justice. But we also have a human responsibility to remain open to the possibility of change. If we decide that a person is only ever the worst thing they've ever done, then we've given up on the idea of humanity altogether." He stood up. He winced as his wounded arm shifted. "Dignity is a two-way street," Wyatt continued, his voice finding that slow, conversational beat. "I have to respect your right to be whole, and you have to allow for the possibility that I can be more than a mistake. That's how we heal a town. Not with more laws, not with more cattle. We heal it by deciding that our neighbor's pain is just as real as our own. We heal it by deciding that we are going to be allies instead of obstacles." The door at the end of the hall opened. Elias Reed stepped through. He was dusty. He looked like he'd ridden 100 miles since midnight. "The judge is in his chambers," Elias said. "He's seen the ledger. He's seen the names. He's not a happy man, Wyatt." "Is Sterling in town?" Wyatt asked. "He's at the hotel," Elias replied. "He brought 10 men with him. They're sitting on the porch like they own the street. They aren't hiding anymore." Wyatt checked his sidearm. It was a mechanical movement. But his face stayed soft. He looked at me one last time before we moved toward the courtroom. "Abigail," he said, "one more thing about the blanket." I looked up. "It's just wool," he said. "It can be torn. It can be burned. But the kindness you showed when you sold it, that's eternal. That's a part of you that Silas Sterling can never touch. Don't ever forget that your value comes from what you are willing to give, not from what you are forced to lose. We are going in there now to demand the law. But don't ever think the law is what makes you important. You were important the moment you breathed your first breath." I stood up. I folded the blue blanket and laid it on the bench. I didn't need to carry it into the courtroom. I was already wearing the warmth Wyatt had given back to me. We walked down the hall. 3 people, a sheriff, a deputy, a widow. The air felt different. It felt like the world was starting to tilt back toward the light. "Wyatt," I said as we reached the double doors of the court. He stopped. "Thank you," I said, "for the words, not just the blanket." He nodded once. "The words are the only thing that lasts, Abigail. Everything else is just dust in the wind." We pushed open the doors. The room was full of people, the small holders, the families from the ledger. They were sitting in the pews, their hats in their hands, their eyes full of a desperate, flickering hope. At the front of the room sat Silas Sterling. He was dressed in a suit of dark broadcloth. He looked like a man who had never known a day of cold in his life. He looked at Wyatt. Then he looked at me. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who thought he had already bought the judge, the jury, and the very air we were breathing. But he didn't know about the blanket. He didn't know about the conversation in the hall. He didn't know that we had stopped playing his game. Wyatt walked right up to the rail. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor," Wyatt said, his voice rang out in the quiet room, "we are here to talk about the truth, not the version of it that was bought and paid for, the version that belongs to the people of this valley." The judge looked down over his spectacles. "This is highly irregular, Sheriff." "The whole valley is irregular. Your Honor, Wyatt replied. We've been living in a shadow. We're here to let the sun in. I sat down in the front row. I felt Silas's ledger in my lap. I felt the weight of it, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a foundation. Wyatt turned his head just a fraction. He looked at Sterling. Silas, Wyatt said, I hope you've enjoyed the dark, because it's over. We're done being afraid of a man who thinks he's bigger than the people he robs. Sterling's smile didn't fade, but his eyes went cold. He leaned back in his chair. You're a dead man, Wyatt, Sterling whispered. You just don't know it yet. Maybe, Wyatt said, but I'll be a dead man who did the right thing. And that's a hell of a lot better than being a rich man who did the wrong one. The gavel came down. It sounded like a gunshot. The trial was starting. But the healing, that had already begun. The courtroom was hot. Not just summer hot. It was a thick, heavy heat that came from too many bodies packed into too small a space, all of them waiting for a man to fall. Wyatt sat at the front. He didn't look back at the pews. He kept his eyes on the judge bench. I sat right behind him. I could see the way his shoulders were set. He looked like a man standing in a storm, bracing for the wind to change. And it was about to change. Silas Sterling didn't have a lawyer. Not a real one. He had a man in a city suit who knew how to twist words until they looked like pretzels. The man stood up. He walked to the center of the room. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the townspeople. We are here to talk about land, the lawyer said. His voice was smooth. Too smooth, like grease on a skillet. But land is just dirt. What we are really here to talk about is the character of the men who walk on it. He reached into a leather satchel. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It looked old. It looked official. I have here the original incident report, the lawyer continued. The one filed 4 years ago, the night Silas Vance died. It was signed by Sheriff Wyatt Coldwell, the same man sitting here today, claiming to be a champion of the poor. The lawyer walked over to Wyatt. He held the paper under Wyatt's nose. Sheriff, the lawyer said, does this report state that Silas Vance was caught red-handed stealing cattle from the Sterling Ranch? Does it say that he drew a weapon first? And does it say that you, and you alone, made the decision to fire because you believed he was a danger to the community? Wyatt didn't blink. It says that. But it doesn't say why. The why is for the law to decide, not for a sheriff who has suddenly developed a guilty conscience. The lawyer snapped. He turned back to the room. The evidence shows that the man Abigail Vance calls a hero was actually a common thief, and the man she calls a villain, my client, Mr. Sterling, was simply a victim trying to protect his property. A murmur went through the room. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at the back of Wyatt's head. I wanted him to stand up. I wanted him to shout, but he just sat there, as still as a stone. The judge leaned forward. Sheriff Coldwell, is this your signature? It is, Wyatt said. And was the information in this report accurate at the time you wrote it? Wyatt paused. He looked at me. Then he looked at the judge. It was accurate to the lie I was told. It was not accurate to the truth I ignored. The lawyer laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. A lie you were told? By whom? By your own eyes? By the man who paid for the bullets, Wyatt said. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Sheriff, you are treading on dangerous ground. The trial took a recess an hour later. The heat had become unbearable. Wyatt walked out into the hallway. I followed him. He went to a far corner, away from the crowds. He looked tired. He looked like he was losing the fight before it had even really started. He's using your own words against you. Wyatt, I said. I was holding the blue blanket in my arms. I didn't know why I'd brought it, but I needed something to hold on to. Wyatt looked at the paper the lawyer had left on the bench. He had a copy of it in his hand. He looked at the words he'd written 4 years ago. "Abigail?" Wyatt said. He sounded like a man who was explaining a hard lesson to a child, a lesson he'd learned the long way. "We need to talk about the danger of the partial truth. Listen to me closely. This is something every person in this valley needs to understand." He leaned against the wall. His rhythmic voice filled the small space between us. "There is a difference between a fact and the truth," Wyatt said. "A fact is that I shot your husband. That is on the paper. But the truth is that your husband was lured there. The truth is that the weapon he drew was a piece of wood he was using as a cane. When we take a piece of the story and leave out the heart of it, we aren't just misinforming people. We are robbing them of the ability to make a moral choice. A person has a right to the whole story, because without the whole story, justice is just a coin toss." He tapped the report with his finger. "This is the wrong evidence," Wyatt continued. "It's wrong because it's incomplete, and an incomplete truth is the most dangerous kind of lie. It's a lie that wears the skin of an honest man. We have a responsibility to look past the ink on the page. We have a responsibility to demand the context, because context is where the humanity lives. Silas Sterling wants to hide behind the facts so he can kill the truth." I looked at the report. I saw Wyatt's name. I saw the date. I saw the cold, hard words. "But you wrote it, Wyatt," I said. "You were the one who gave him the mask to wear." "I was," Wyatt said. He didn't look away, and that is my greatest sin. I allowed my position of authority to give weight to a story I hadn't fully vetted. I lent my integrity to a man who had none. And here is the lesson in that, Abigail. Responsibility isn't something you can cut into pieces. You either take the whole thing, or you take none of it. If I take the credit for the peace in this town, I have to take the blame for the blood in the dust. You can't pick and choose which parts of your life you want to be accountable for." He stood up straight. He looked toward the courtroom doors. "They think that report is their shield," Wyatt said. "But I'm going to make it their noose. I'm going to go back in there, and I'm going to tell them about the rest of the night. The parts I left out because I was afraid. The parts I left out because I wanted to believe I was the hero." He looked at me. "Are you still with me, even after seeing that?" I looked at the blue blanket. I looked at the man who had brought it back for me. "The truth is a heavy thing, Wyatt," I said, "but I think I'd rather be crushed by the truth than kept warm by a lie." Wyatt nodded once. "Then let's go finish it." We walked back into the room. The air was even hotter now. Silas Sterling was whispering to his lawyer. He looked confident. He looked like a man who had already won. But then Elias Reed walked in. He wasn't alone. Behind him were 3 men I hadn't seen in years. They were older. They were ragged. They were the men who had worked the Sterling Ranch 4 years ago. The men who had been told to keep their mouths shut or find a shallow grave. Wyatt stood up before the judge could even sit down. "Your Honor," Wyatt said, "the defense has presented an incident report. I would like to present the witnesses who saw me write it, and I would like them to tell you what Silas Sterling was holding over their heads while I was holding that pen." Sterling's lawyer jumped up. "This is a circus. These men are drunks and vagrants." "They are human beings," Wyatt shouted. His voice was like a thunderclap in the small room, and their right to be heard is just as sacred as your right to speak. In this courtroom, we are going to respect the dignity of the witness, regardless of the dirt on his boots. The judge looked at the 3 men. He looked at Sterling. Then he looked at Wyatt. "Sit down, counselor," the judge said to the lawyer. "I want to hear what these men have to say." One by one, the men took the stand. They told the story Wyatt had been too blind to see. They told how Sterling had moved the cattle himself. They told how he had called the sheriff. Knowing Wyatt was a man who acted first and asked questions later. They told how Sterling had threatened to burn their homes if they ever told the truth. As the afternoon shadows grew long, the wrong evidence began to crumble. The facts were still there, but the truth was finally starting to breathe. Wyatt looked at me from the front of the room. He didn't smile. But for the first time, he didn't look like he was bracing for the storm. He looked like he was finally part of the light. "Listen," Wyatt whispered as the final witness stepped down. I listened. It wasn't the sound of gunfire. It wasn't the sound of a gavel. It was the sound of 100 people finally realizing they'd been lied to. It was the sound of a town reclaiming its own soul. "Responsibility," Wyatt said to the room, his voice calm and rhythmic. "It's a hard word. It's a heavy word. But it's the only word that makes us free. We are all responsible for what we allow to happen in our presence. Today, we are choosing to be responsible for the truth." Silas Sterling stood up. He didn't look like a rich man anymore. He looked like a man who had run out of places to hide. He looked at the door. But Elias Reed was standing there. And Elias wasn't moving. The sun went down behind the courthouse, leaving the room in a soft orange glow. The trial wasn't over, but the mask was gone. And in the Montana territory, once the mask is gone, it never quite fits the same way again. I held my blanket tight. I looked at the North Star through the high window. It was still there, steady, honest, and for the first time, I felt like we were finally standing on the same ground. The moon was a sliver of ice over the Montana peaks. The courtroom had been a furnace, but the night was a whetstone. Sharp, cold, and quiet. I found Wyatt sitting on the steps of the old schoolhouse. He wasn't wearing the badge. He wasn't wearing the sheepskin coat. He was just a man in a thin shirt, shivering in the dark. He looked like he was waiting for the world to finish what it started 4 years ago. I walked up and stood beside him. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just let the silence sit between us. It was a heavy silence. It was full of the things we had said in court, and the things we hadn't dared to say in private. "You should be in bed, Abigail," Wyatt said. He didn't look up. His voice was a dry rattle. "I've spent enough time in bed staring at the ceiling," I said. "I'd rather be out here staring at the truth." Wyatt let out a long, shaky breath. He looked at his hands. "Sterling is going to burn the town before he lets that verdict stand. You know that, don't you? He's got men coming from the South, professional killers, men who don't care about ledgers or laws." "I know," I said, "but that's for tomorrow. Tonight, I want to know about the fire." Wyatt finally looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept since the Grant administration. "Listen to me, Abigail," Wyatt said. He leaned back against the porch railing. His voice took on that slow, rhythmic beat. "We need to talk about the nature of a broken spirit. There is a lesson in vulnerability that most men spend their whole lives trying to outrun." He paused, looking at the shadows of the pine trees. "People think that a man like me, a man with gold and a badge, is solid," Wyatt said. "They think we are built of granite. But the truth is, we are more like the snow on those ridges. We look strong until the fire gets too close. For 4 years, I have been a hollow man. I let Silas Sterling fill that hollowness with his lies because it was easier than facing the fact that I had failed. I was so afraid of being vulnerable, of being wrong. that I became a monster's right hand. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leaden slug, a bullet that had never been fired. There is a deep value in being honest about our weakness, Wyatt continued. When we pretend we are invincible, we become brittle. We become dangerous. True strength isn't the absence of fear or the absence of mistakes. It is the raw vulnerability of saying, I am lost and I don't know the way home. Until a man can say those words, he isn't a leader. He's just a statue. I had to lose everything, my pride, my reputation, my comfort, just to become a human being again. I sat down on the step below him. I could feel the cold rising from the earth. I wanted to kill you today, I said. I didn't whisper it. I said it plain. When that lawyer showed the report. When I realized the man who had been helping me was the man who had taken everything from me. I wanted to see you bleed. Wyatt nodded. You had every right. That's the debt I'll never be able to pay. But here's what I realized, I said, turning to look at him. And I want you to hear this, Wyatt, because this is the lesson I'm carrying. I took a breath. The air was so cold it stung my lungs. Forgiveness isn't a feeling, I said, my voice steady and rhythmic. It's a decision to stop the cycle of blood. Listen to me. If I take my revenge on you, I am just becoming another Silas Sterling. I am saying that violence is the only language we have left. Compassion isn't a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate form of power. It is the power to say, the hurt stops with me. When we choose to forgive a person who is truly seeking to change, we aren't letting them off the hook. We are giving the world a chance to start over. Wyatt stared at me. He looked like he was seeing me for the first time. You're using my guilt as a weapon for justice, he whispered. I am, I said. I'm not going to let you hide in your shame. Shame is a selfish thing, Wyatt. It makes you focus on your own pain. I need you to focus on the town's pain. I need you to take that vulnerability and turn it into a shield. You owe that to Silas. You owe it to the families in that ledger. And you owe it to the man you were supposed to be. Wyatt stood up. He didn't look like a statue anymore. He looked like a man who had been through the fire and come out different. You're right, Wyatt said. He looked toward the south, where the horizon was a bruised purple. Compassion is a choice, and tonight I'm choosing to stand. Not because I'm a hero, but because I'm a man who finally understands that a life built on a lie is a life that's already dead. He reached down and offered me his hand. This time, I took it, not as a widow taking help from a sheriff, but as one soul recognizing another. Tomorrow will be the hardest day of our lives, Wyatt said. Sterling will come with everything he has. He'll try to prove that gold is stronger than truth. But he's wrong. Gold melts. Truth just gets harder in the heat. He looked at the schoolhouse behind us. It was a skeleton, but it was standing. Listen, Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational hum. There is one last thing you need to understand about this struggle. Dignity isn't something you can buy back once you've sold it, but you can earn it back through service. I spent a long time trying to buy my way into heaven, but I found out that the only way to get there is to walk through the hell you created and help as many people out as you can on the way. I walked with him toward the horses. The wind was picking up. It was bringing the smell of more snow, but it didn't feel as cold as it had before. Wyatt, I said as he climbed into the saddle. Yeah, Abigail? You failed the test, I said. The one you set for me in the snow. You thought you were testing my heart, but the whole time, the world was testing yours. And you almost didn't make the grade. Wyatt gripped the reins. He looked at the blue blanket draped over my arm. I know, he said, but I'm still taking the exam. and I'm not handing in my paper until the sun comes up on a free Silver Creek." He kicked his horse into a gallop. I watched him disappear into the dark. He was riding toward the town, toward the fight, and toward the man he was finally becoming. I stood there for a long time, the blue wool clutched to my chest. I thought about the fire and the snow. I thought about the weight of a man's soul, and I realized that Wyatt Coldwell was wrong about one thing. He didn't need to earn his dignity back. He just had to stop pretending he'd ever lost the right to try. The night was long. The snow began to fall, soft and white, covering the tracks we'd made in the mud. By morning, the world would look clean, but underneath the white, the truth was waiting. And so was I. The sun didn't just rise over Silver Creek that morning. It crawled. It was a cold, hard gold coin that no one in town felt like they could spend. I stood on the boardwalk in front of the church. The air was so still, you could hear a pine needle hit the dirt 3 blocks away. Wyatt was there. He was leaning against a hitching post, checking the cylinder of his Colt. He looked older than the mountains. But he didn't look tired anymore. He looked finished, like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, very crooked road. Elias Reed stood on the other side of the street. He had a shotgun cradled in his arms. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking south, toward the dust cloud that was starting to smudge the horizon. Sterling's men were coming. "They'll be here in 10 minutes, Wyatt said. He didn't look up from his gun. "Abigail, I want you inside the stone walls of the courthouse. The ledger stays with you. If this goes sideways, you run for the high country. Don't look back." I looked at the people stepping out onto their porches. Old Miller was there. The 3 ranch hands from the trial were there. Even the shopkeepers were standing in their doorways, holding old squirrel rifles and broomsticks. "I'm not running, Wyatt," I said, "and neither are they." Wyatt finally looked up. He saw the townspeople. He saw the way they were looking at him. Not as a sheriff, but as a neighbor who had finally stopped lying. He climbed up onto the boardwalk and signaled for the crowd to come closer. He waited until they were all standing in the dirt, their faces pale in the early light. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that rhythmic, heavy beat that made you stop and listen. "Listen to me," Wyatt said, "every one of you. We need to talk about why we are standing in the street today. This isn't just about cattle. It isn't just about land. It's about the principle of solidarity. And you need to hear what that means." He stepped to the edge of the boards, looking every man and woman in the eye. "There is a lie that men like Silas Sterling want you to believe," Wyatt said. "They want you to believe that we are all alone. They want you to believe that your neighbor's hunger is his problem, and your neighbor's debt is her funeral. They want us divided, because a divided people are easy to rob. They want us to think that our rights are private property, that we have to hoard." He shook his head. "But that is a poison," Wyatt continued. "The true value of a community is the understanding that an injury to one is an injury to all. That is the definition of solidarity. It is the moral obligation to recognize that your neighbor's dignity is the only shield you have for your own. If Silas Sterling can steal the land from the widow Vance today, he can steal the shop from the merchant tomorrow. A community is only as strong as the protection it offers its most vulnerable member. If we don't stand together as a single, unbreakable unit, then we are all just waiting for our turn to be devoured." Miller nodded. He held his rifle a little tighter. "Solidarity is the only thing gold can't buy," Wyatt said. "It is the radical idea that we are responsible for one another. Not because we're friends, not because we like each other, but because we are human beings sharing the same air. Today, we aren't just defending a ledger. We are defending the idea that no man is a kingdom unto himself. We are a people, and a people cannot be evicted. The sound of hooves hit the edge of town then. It was a heavy, thundering sound. 10 men rode in. They were dressed in long duster coats. Their hats were pulled low. They didn't look like cowboys. They looked like professional grief. In the center of them was Silas Sterling. He was riding a white mare that looked too clean for the dirt of Silver Creek. Sterling pulled up 10 feet from Wyatt. He looked at the townspeople. He looked at the squirrel rifles. He laughed. It was a cold, thin sound. "This is a lot of theater for a dead man, Wyatt," Sterling said. "Move aside. Give me the widow and the book, and I'll leave the rest of this town to rot in peace." Wyatt didn't move. He didn't even put his hand on his gun. He just stood there, looking like a man who had already seen the end of the movie. "You don't understand the math, Silas," Wyatt said. His voice was conversational, rhythmic. "You brought 10 men who are fighting for $20 a head. I'm standing with 100 people who are fighting for their souls. Those men behind you, they'll fire a shot, maybe 2, but they won't die for your bank account. These people, they'll stand until the sun goes cold." Sterling narrowed his eyes. "You think these sheep will fight? They aren't sheep," Wyatt said. "They're a community, and you're about to learn the difference." Wyatt turned to the townspeople. "Tell him," he said. "Tell him whose town this is." It started with Miller. "It's our town," the old man croaked. Then the ranch hands. "It's our town." Then the women, the children, the shopkeepers. It grew into a roar that echoed off the canyon walls. It wasn't a shout of anger. It was a statement of fact. Sterling's mercenaries looked at each other. They looked at the sheer mass of people standing in the street. They looked at Wyatt, who was standing there with a peace that surpassed understanding. "Justice," Wyatt said, looking back at Sterling. "It's a word you've used to decorate your lies. But here is the verbal truth of it, Silas. Justice is the social expression of love. It is the demand that every person be treated with the radical equality they were born with. You thought you could buy the law, but you forgot that the law is just a shadow. The people are the sun, and the sun is up." One of Sterling's men, a fellow with a jagged scar across his nose, looked at the white mare. Then he looked at the crowd. He spat in the dirt and turned his horse around. "I didn't sign up to shoot a whole county, Sterling," the mercenary said. "Keep your $20. I'd rather keep my hide." One by one, the men in the dusters turned their horses. They didn't look back. They rode out of Silver Creek the same way they came in, like shadows retreating from a fire. Silas Sterling was left alone in the middle of the street. He looked at his hands. He looked at Wyatt. The white mare stepped nervously, sensing the shift in the world. "You've ruined me," Sterling whispered. "No," Wyatt said. "You ruined yourself. We just stopped helping you do it." Elias Reed walked forward. He didn't use his shotgun. He just reached up and took the white mare's bridle. "It's over, Silas," Elias said. "The judge is waiting. And this time, he's not interested in your ledger. He's interested in your confession." The townspeople didn't cheer. They didn't rush forward to hurt him. They just opened a path. It was a quiet, dignified path that led straight to the courthouse doors. Wyatt walked over to me. He was shaking, just a little. He looked at the blue blanket in my arms, and he touched the corner of it. "We did it," I said. "No," Wyatt said. He looked at the people of Silver Creek as they began to talk to one another, shaking hands, checking on neighbors. "They did it. I just gave them the words to remember who they were. He leaned against the courthouse railing. Abigail, Wyatt said. He sounded like a man who was finally letting go of a heavy suitcase. I want you to remember this day, but because of why we won. Solidarity isn't a feeling, it's a practice. It's the constant, daily choice to see yourself in the person standing next to you. If we keep doing that, men like Sterling can never come back. Because there's no room for a tyrant in a town where everyone is a neighbor. I looked up at the courthouse. The sun was hitting the windows, making them look like they were full of fire. What happens now, Wyatt? Wyatt looked at his badge. He unpinned it. He looked at it for a long time, the silver glinting in his palm. Now, he said, we start the real work. We rebuild the school. We fix the fences. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I'll find out what it's like to be a man who doesn't have to test anyone's heart to know it's good. He handed me the badge. Keep this, he said, as a reminder, not of the law, but of the day the law finally started listening to the truth. The street was full of light. The dust was settling. And for the first time in 1878, the Montana Territory felt like a place where a person could actually breathe. I tucked the badge into the folds of my blue blanket. I looked at the man who had been a rich rancher and a dying drifter, and I realized he was finally something better. He was a part of us, and in Silver Creek, that was more than enough. The grass in Montana has a way of hiding the scars. 2 months had passed since the dust settled in the street of Silver Creek. The snow was a memory. The creeks were running fat and fast with the melt. The valley was green, a deep, impossible green that looked like it had never known a winter. Sterling was gone. The circuit judge hadn't just looked at the ledger. He had used it like a map to undo every lie Sterling had told for a decade. The land was going back to the families. The hidden debts were erased. Cisnus Sterling himself was sitting in a stone cell in Helena, waiting for a trial that would likely take the rest of his natural life. I was sitting on the porch of the schoolhouse. It wasn't a skeleton anymore. It had a roof, it had glass in the windows, it had a bell that rang every morning at 8 o'clock. The sound of it carried all the way to the high ridges. It was a clear, bright sound. It was the sound of a debt finally being paid in full. Wyatt was out by the fence. He wasn't wearing a sheriff's vest. He was wearing a work shirt, sweat-stained and dusty. He was digging a post hole. He'd been doing that a lot lately, working with his hands, building things he didn't own. He dropped the shovel and walked toward the porch. He sat on the top step, wiping his brow with a bandana. He looked at the schoolhouse. Then he looked at me. It's a good building, Abigail, Wyatt said. His voice was quiet, rhythmic, like the hum of the bees in the clover. Your husband knew what he was doing with those rafters. He did, I said. I had the blue blanket draped over my knees. The air was warm, but I liked the weight of it. He knew that a building is only as strong as the intent behind it. Wyatt nodded. He leaned back against the post. He looked out at the valley he used to think he ruled. Abigail, Wyatt said. He sounded like a man who had finally found the words for a thought he'd been carrying since the first day in the snow. We need to talk about the final lesson of this journey. We need to talk about the difference between a contract and a covenant. And you need to hear this out loud. He looked at his calloused palms. In the world of business, the world I lived in for too long, we have contracts, Wyatt said. A contract is a deal. It says, I will do this if you do that. It's a transaction. It's based on suspicion. It's based on protecting yourself from the other person. It's what Silas Sterling used to choke this valley. He thought every human relationship was just a contract to be exploited. He paused, a slow smile touching the corners of his mouth. But a covenant is something else entirely, Wyatt continued. A covenant is a promise between two people to seek the other's good, regardless of the cost to themselves. It isn't a transaction. It is a commitment to the radical idea of mutual flourishing. Listen to me closely. The educational value of what we've done here isn't just that we caught a thief. It is that we moved from a world of contracts to a world of covenants. We decided that we were going to be responsible for each other's dignity, not because we had to, but because we chose to. He looked at the finished schoolhouse. That's what this building really is, Wyatt said. It's a covenant with the future. It's us saying that the children of this valley have an inherent right to knowledge, not because their parents can pay for it, but because they are human beings who deserve to grow. True honor isn't about keeping your side of a bargain. It's about being a person who can be trusted to uphold the dignity of others, even when there is nothing in it for you. I felt the truth of it settle over me. It was the missing piece. It was why the town felt so different. It wasn't just the lack of fear, it was the presence of a promise. You're a better teacher than you are a sheriff, Wyatt, I said. Wyatt laughed. A real laugh. I think I'm just a better student than I used to be. He stood up and looked at the blue blanket. He reached out and touched the wool. I spent a lot of time testing people, Abigail, Wyatt said. I thought I could weigh a heart like a bag of grain, but I learned that you can't truly see a person until you stop judging them. You have to start by accepting their intrinsic worth. Once you do that, the test becomes unnecessary. You don't have to check if a person is good when you've already decided that they are valuable. He walked down the steps, then stopped and turned back. There is one more thing, he said, about the blanket and about forgiveness. I waited. The rhythmic pause in his speech felt like a heartbeat. Forgiveness is the highest form of human agency, Wyatt said. Listen to me. When we hold on to a grudge, we are letting the past dictate our current actions. We are giving the person who hurt us power over our future. But when we choose to forgive, as you have chosen to forgive me, we are reclaiming our own power. We are saying, the past is a fact, but it is not a prison. Forgiveness is the act of setting yourself free to become someone new. It is the most courageous thing a human being can do because it requires you to trust again without any guarantee of safety. He looked at me with an intensity that made the Montana sun feel dim. You gave me back my soul, Abigail, Wyatt whispered, not because I deserved it, but because you had the dignity to offer it. And that is a gift I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor. He turned and walked back to the fence. He picked up the shovel. He went back to work. I sat there for a long time. The shadows of the rafters grew long across the porch. I thought about the journey. The dying man in the snow, the ledger in the dark, the stand in the street. I looked at the blue blanket. It was just wool. But it had covered a sheriff's shame. It had covered a widow's grief. And now it was just a part of the summer. Elias Reed rode up an hour later. He wasn't wearing a badge either. He was wearing a plain coat. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had finally seen the law become justice. Wyatt still digging? Elias asked, dismounting. He is, I said. He says he's building a covenant. Elias smiled. He always was a man for a big word, but I think he's finally found one that fits. Elias sat on the edge of the porch. The families are moving back to the North Creek today. The Miller boys are helping them move the furniture. No one is charging a dime. It's a strange sight. Abigail, People just helping, without a ledger in sight. It's not strange, Elias, I said. It's just human. We just forgot how to do it for a while. I suppose so, Elias said. He looked at me. The judge wanted me to ask you something.
About the schoolhouse. He wants to know what you're going to name it.
I looked at the building. I looked at the rafters Silas had carved. Then I looked at the man digging post holes in the sun. It doesn't need a name, I said. It just needs to be open. That's the whole point, isn't it? That the door is always open. Elias nodded. I'll tell him. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in strokes of violet and orange, Wyatt finished the fence. He walked back to the porch. He looked tired, but he looked whole. One last thing, Abigail, Wyatt said, leaning against the railing. What's that? About the medicine, he said. The stuff you bought with the $2 from the blanket. Back in chapter 1, I smiled. Well, what about it? It tasted like kerosene and old socks, Wyatt said. It was the best I could afford, I replied. It was the best I ever had, Wyatt said. Because it didn't just heal my body, it healed my perspective. And that is the most important medicine a person can ever receive. To see the world as it really is, a place of shared struggle and shared hope, and to decide to be a part of the healing instead of the hurt. He offered me his hand. Walk with me to the creek? I took his hand. It was solid. It was real. We walked down the hill toward the water. The air was full of the scent of pine and wild roses. The North Star was starting to blink into existence, steady and honest as always. Listen, Wyatt whispered as we reached the bank. I listened. It wasn't the sound of gunfire. It wasn't the sound of a gavel. It was the sound of a town at peace. The sound of children laughing in the distance. The sound of a river that didn't belong to anyone and therefore belonged to everyone. We are all just travelers, Abigail, Wyatt said. His voice was a soft rhythm in the dusk. And the only thing that makes the trip worthwhile is the kindness we show to the people we meet along the way. That's the only truth that matters. Everything else is just dust in the wind. I leaned my head against his shoulder. The blue blanket was still in my arms. I looked at the water. I looked at the stars. And for the first time in a very long time, the Montana Territory felt like home. The story of the rich rancher and the widow was over. But the story of Wyatt and Abigail, that was just beginning. And I had a feeling it was going to be a long, honest tale. The end wasn't a closing of a door. It was the opening of a window. And the light was coming in. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
In the end, the story of Abigail Vance and Wyatt Caldwell is not simply a tale of a widow, a sheriff, a cruel rancher, or a town buried under fear. It is a story about what happens when one small act of mercy becomes strong enough to challenge an entire world built on greed. Abigail had almost nothing when she found that stranger in the snow. She had no fortune, no protection, and no certainty that tomorrow would be kinder than yesterday. All she had was a blue blanket, a wounded heart, and a belief that a human life was still worth saving. And that belief changed everything. This story reminds us that kindness is never small. A cup of broth, a blanket given away, a hand extended to someone who seems forgotten. These things may look simple, but in a cold and selfish world, they can become acts of great courage. Abigail teaches us that dignity does not belong only to the rich, the powerful, or the respected. Dignity belongs to every person from the moment they draw breath. Poverty does not make a soul less worthy. Grief does not make a woman weak. And power, if it does not protect the vulnerable, is nothing more than cruelty wearing a fine coat. Wyatt's journey gives us another lesson. Redemption is possible, but it must be earned. He could not undo the pain he had caused. He could not bring back the dead or erase the years of silence, but he could choose to stop hiding behind guilt. He could stand beside the truth, even when that truth exposed his own failure. His transformation shows us that a person is not healed by pride, excuses, or punishment, but by responsibility. Real change begins when a man is brave enough to say, "I was wrong," and strong enough to spend the rest of his life making that wrong answer to justice. And then there is Silver Creek itself, a town that learned the meaning of solidarity. For too long, fear kept its people apart. Each family thought their pain was private, their debt was their own burden, their suffering something to be endured in silence. But when they finally stood together, they discovered that a community is not built by contracts, coins, or threats. It is built by neighbors who refuse to let one another be crushed. The story tells us that when one person is treated as worthless, everyone's humanity is in danger. But when people rise together, even the most powerful tyrant can lose his grip. So the value of this story is clear. Compassion can awaken truth, truth can build justice, and justice can heal what fear has broken. Abigail's blanket became more than wool. It became a symbol of mercy. The ledger became more than evidence. It became a voice for the silenced. And Silver Creek became more than a frontier town. It became proof that even in the harshest land, the human heart can still choose light. May this story remind us to look closer at the people around us, to see the lonely, the poor, the wounded, and the forgotten, not as burdens, but as human beings worthy of care. May it remind us that love is not always soft. Sometimes love stands in a courtroom, faces a gunman, tells the truth, and refuses to back down. And above all, may it teach us that the world changes when ordinary people decide that mercy, dignity, and justice are worth more than comfort, gold, or fear.